When I lived in Australia, it often felt like my flatmate and I were speaking different languages. One day she said, "You should ask your friends over for tea." "Sure." "Wait, what do you mean by tea?" She meant the evening meal that I would call dinner or supper. But for me, tea meant an afternoon drink with maybe a snack. That wasn't the only misunderstanding we had, and it could all be attributed to our own cultural biases. Escape rooms are live-action games set in immersive environments. In creating these environments, many designers base their games off of real-world settings or specific fictional worlds. While these settings allow a designer to create challenges that are authentic and embedded in the world, they also carry a risk that some players who do not have the cultural background needed to succeed will be frustrated and unable to engage with the game. Escape rooms have evolved from the first games to appear in North America, which often was only a simple room filled to the brim with puzzles and locks. However, cultural bias still persists, especially for players who travel to play escape rooms or who grew up in a different decade, region, or culture from the game designer. Essentially, cultural bias in escape rooms occurs when a game designer assumes a degree of common knowledge based on their own experiences. My name is Shannon McDowell, and for the last few years, I've worked with Scott Nicholson at the BGNlab at Wilfrid Laurier University in Brantford, Ontario, Canada. We were funded by Red Bull to explore issues of cultural bias in escape room design. The purpose of this video is to provide a guide for escape room creators to assist them in reducing cultural bias in their own escape room designs. In a series of interviews with escape room enthusiasts, players described their experiences with cultural bias in escape rooms. 64% of experiences were reported negatively, using words such as confusing, unfair, and frustrating. Encountering cultural bias in escape rooms caused players to lose the game flow. That is, players were removed from the immersiveness of the setting and experience. It caused them to lose confidence in the game design so that they second-guessed any future design choices. And it caused them to involuntarily skip challenges when players already possessed the knowledge needed to solve the puzzles. To assist escape room designers in minimizing cultural bias in their designs and in improving the player experience, we examined the three major components of escape room design through the lenses of language, symbols, norms, artifacts, and knowledge. Every interaction a player has with escape room staff is an opportunity to improve their play experience. From the game introduction or briefing, to hint delivery, to actors, interactions with escape room staff should set expectations for the game and actively influence players' engagement with the game and narrative world. For players who don't speak the native language of the game, can the introduction or game briefing be done without language? Can documents be translated? Can an actor use gestures to convey information? Can hints be conveyed through a spotlight or an animation? Setting expectations for players means making sure they know what to expect in the game. Include warnings for game events that might be triggering, such as flashing lights or gore. Ensure players know how locks work, how they will receive hints, and how safety icons work in the game. Most importantly, gauge players' understanding of the game's goals and theme. This can help you deliver more relevant and useful hints. Actors and good scripting can do a lot to minimize the impact of cultural bias on players. I personally played a game that culminated in a shootout between multiple actors. Despite 20 other players in the room with them, no one startled or experienced obvious distress when the gunfire began, due to the actors' excellent telegraphing to prepare players. They started with an argument that got louder and louder, then weapons were pulled, but pointed at the ceiling, then pointed at the other actors while still arguing, and only then did someone fire. The gradual acceleration of the argument and introducing the visual of the guns before they became a threat foreshadowed the future violence, so the surrounding players knew what to expect. My favorite part of escape rooms is solving the puzzles and other challenges in the game. But this is also where escape room designers need to be most aware of the cultural biases in their game. To give some examples of possible biases and ways to mitigate them, I'm going to quickly run through the 5 lenses of language, symbols, norms, artifacts, and knowledge. Written language was the example most commonly encountered in challenges, although there are some cases of spoken language as well. For players who are not fluent in the language of the game, the existence of language as part of a challenge can impede their understanding, the context in which it fits into the narrative, and the ability to solve it. For example, interpretation of cursive handwriting is a skill that varies with the age and experience of the player, even in native speakers. As some regions have stopped teaching cursive in schools, game masters will have to adapt to their team's needs. This may involve sacrificing immersion to replace historically accurate handwriting with a printed font that is easier for players to read. In challenges, symbols are most often seen as icons or objects. In this case, cultural bias occurs when players don't recognize specific symbols in order to connect them to a puzzle or to identify the meaning they represent. For example, in a room requiring players to read a Roman numeral, the designers also included tombstones that had years in both Arabic and Roman numerals. The examples were chosen so that they would provide players with all the information needed to determine the Roman numeral solution. However, this design did still have an assumption that players understood the basic concept of how Roman numerals worked so that they could interpret the numbers on the tombstones. Norms are essentially social standards or patterns. In escape rooms, cultural bias manifests through norms as folkways, which are informal standards of behavior, mores or laws, taboos, genres, or rituals. When norms are an important part of a puzzle, make sure that what the player has to do is clear, whether that's through instructions or setting expectations during the game briefing, or through set design and environmental storytelling. For example, some rooms create challenges that require players to circumvent the rules to accomplish, such as being expected to break something when they've been told not to use force. Escape rooms create a social contract with players. The players will play within the confines of the rules provided, and in exchange, the game will be fair and winnable within those confines. Players really shouldn't be asked to circumvent the game's rules or to break laws. This may appear to result in an interesting decision for the players, but in our study, players who experienced this were frustrated and had a negative impression of the challenge. If a designer wishes to play with this concept, then there should be a clear distinction between game rules that are unbreakable, so those presented by the game master outside of the game space, and rules in the narrative that are breakable, which would be those presented by a non-player character or posted on the wall within the game space. Artifacts are the physical items that players interact with in the game. Think about music or scent identification, puzzles requiring use of unfamiliar tools or knowledge of unfamiliar games, or even puzzles requiring players to find something on the internet or in a Bible. These types of artifacts are difficult to interact with, especially on a time limit. If a player grew up in another country, has never experienced those tools or games, or is old enough or young enough that certain technology is unfamiliar to them. Assist players with environmental storytelling, such as a picture showing the object being used, or video from security footage. For example, there was a room that required players to identify the smell of camel dung. For players without that cultural knowledge, having a hitching post earlier in the game with a saddle or blanket that also smelled the same would provide the cultural reference needed. Although in the case of learning how to play a game, providing a copy of the rules is not recommended when players are on a time limit. For knowledge challenges, we're primarily looking at trivia and riddles, that is, clever wordplay. Requiring players to know the names of popular celebrities or the location of capital cities doesn't necessarily make for a good puzzle, unless the information can also be found somewhere in the room. Similar to how science and laboratory-themed rooms will have a periodic table on the wall. Riddles, on the other hand, are difficult to translate due to the wordplay involved, and tend to be very culturally specific. If you plan to include riddles or wordplay in your escape room, keep in mind the difficulty for players who are not native speakers, or who have never encountered that riddle before. Elements of set design in escape rooms are part of the player's experience of the game, but not part of any challenge. While elements of set design can distract players from the goal of the game, a skilled designer can use set pieces as environmental storytelling to lead players through the game and signpost their next steps. Think about what elements of your set design include language. Players will always interpret language as a clue until they're able to eliminate it. Try gluing books closed or purposefully blurring the text in newspaper articles to remove the distraction. Eliminating as much language as possible that's not needed for puzzles will be less to translate and less to distract players. Icons used as part of the set design should be recognizable to players if introduced during the game introduction, such as do not touch or safety symbols. But symbols can also be more subtle. Light in certain areas of the room or sounds played from an embedded speaker in a prop will focus players' attention to the objects in that area. For example, if players solve a puzzle, they may hear the sound of a music box coming from another room. This music leads them to a dollhouse, which has lit up to show a clue for the next challenge. Also keep in mind that any artifacts used in set design should fit the theme and genre of the game. Does the item fit into its surroundings? Is there a purpose for the item to be there? Or does it stand out and attract players' attention away from the actual puzzles? Minimizing cultural bias in escape rooms is ultimately about responding to the needs of the players. An immersive, challenging, and enjoyable game can be created that appeals to players from all cultural backgrounds. Lowering the cultural barriers to play the game makes the game more approachable for all players. So to sum up what we've discussed in this video, interactions with escape room staff should set expectations for the game and actively influence the player's engagement with the game and narrative world. Challenges within the game should be fair for all players, using only knowledge found within the game and having been tested by players from a variety of cultural backgrounds. Set design should add to the immersiveness of the environment and supplement rather than detract from the in-game challenges. Keeping these principles in mind when designing an escape room will minimize the possibility that players will have negative experiences. We would like to thank the Red Bull Mind Gamers for their support for this research. To learn more about them, visit mindgamers.redbull.com. Did you solve the puzzle I included in this video? If you did, post the cultural bias inherent in the solution in the comments below.